Okay, we should start. Welcome to the second week of um, social and cultural dynamics. And today we're going to be talking about teamwork, in particular, how diversity and common ground or similarity play a role. But the plan is that we will first do a very brief recap of what we learned on social cognition. And then we will discuss how can we move in a consistent way from what we have learned in the first class, in the first lecture, onto teamwork, from the way that social information is produced, used, et cetera, uh, in a more or less individual context to how we understand the way we coordinate with each other. We'll focus first on the issue of similarity and common ground. We'll then tackle diversity, discuss whether the different uh, discourses that push on diversity and on similarity are at odds with each other or not. And we'll touch a bit on distributed cognition. And then we will be start to move on to the next step, which is the Scrabble experiment, which many of you have already been trying out. And thanks for the logs so far. Keep them coming. And how we're going to deal with that on Friday. And yeah, this will sort of move next week into how do we do the same kind of conceptual and empirical operations, not just on groups of 2 or more people, but on large scale social phenomena like science. So, social cognition. We've seen at least 3 different acceptions of social cognition, which are dealt with in the literature. The first one was the idea that you have your unit of cognitive science, the individual, which processes information about other people. And that's the kind of approach that was the most frequent, at least at the beginning of the studies of social cognition, because you can control for stuff. You can put your participant alone in a dark room in front of a computer, watching a video or whatever stimulus. I think my favorite terrible idea is the reading the mind in the eyes. Have you seen it? That experiment where you only shown a clip from a picture of a person who's supposed to have a certain emotion. And then you have to click on one out of 4 emotions that are written there, right? And that's supposedly a measure of theory of mind, right? Your ability to create mental representations of others. But it's something that's actually quite important, right? We read social cues all the time, but we've also discussed that it's kind of a very partial view on how we do cognition in social contexts. So we also discussed that social cognition is also searching and integrating information from others, right? So it's not just interpreting information about others, but it also trying to figure out, should I do the reading for social and cultural dynamics next week? Right? That's a very individual decision-making process. I'm sure you all looked around at what the other people were doing, right? So that's something also that we do a lot, right? We try to integrate whatever information we have available with what's around us, what other people are doing or saying, or et cetera, et cetera. Then we also seen that there's a third exception of social cognition, which is that cognition can happen in between people, not just inside a person, but actually in the discussion with each other, right? And my favorite example, which is maybe a bit trivial, but is that I can try to read your minds and looking at you and looking at how your eyes are and at whether you're nodding or not, and who's sleeping, to try to figure out whether you're following what I'm saying, or I can ask, right? Do you have questions? Are you all understanding? Right? Uh, or, yeah, there's many examples. I'm not going to go into that because we have lots of materials to cover. But these are three key ways of talking about social cognition, right? So now we want to move that into teamwork, right? And teamwork, for the way we're defining it today, is two or more people engaged in a common activity, right? And we want to understand what are the implications of social cognition as we've just briefly recapped in these interactive contexts. Why are we doing teamwork? Except because it's called social and cultural dynamics. Well, we're doing teamwork today because it's everywhere and we need to deal with it, right? Uh, Again, something that was surprising for me coming from a different country, but in Denmark, you're sort of pushed into having study groups, right? You get study groups even imposed top down from others, and you need to do the study in this social context. So there is a certain discourse stating that groups are better than individuals. And as scientists, we need to apply a critical perspective on that and ask, when are groups better than others, right? And if we have to deal with groups, right, how can we make sure that we design the groups or the conditions in which the groups operate so that they perform at best, right? And if you talk to whoever in the faculty has been working on defining the study groups, that's a non-trivial problem, right? There is also a certain political discourse about the importance of sharing similar values, of being similar to each other in order for whatever social enterprise to work, right? Um, and it's quite important, again, as scientists or as citizens, to have a very critical perspective and try to understand how do we define similarity in these cases, right? And when these kind of similarity or other kinds of similarities are enabling better teamwork? And can we do something to make things better? At the very opposite, often, side of the spectrum, you have a certain political discourse about the importance and cost of diversity, right? Again, I probably don't need to bring a lot of contemporary news into focus, but I have grants from the NIH, the National Institute of Health in the States. And now there is a directive that all the grants that have the word diversity in them should not be funded, right? That you have all these companies like Meta and other big techs that are dropping their diversity, equality, and inclusion departments. And there you can see that there's, on the one hand, right, the previous discourse that would say it's very important to promote diversity for reasons, sometimes equality reasons, sometimes because it actually makes things better in a industry performance kind of way. And now there's kind of the opposite discourse. And that's where we don't want to just take an ideological stance, but actually start doing a bit more critical thinking about these things. Okay, questions about this? Good. So now I want us to do a little exercise, warm-up exercise. But first of all, how were the readings? Now I mentioned that you had to read them. Good. Great. So I want you to think on your own for a minute about the question, what does it take to create good or bad teamwork, right? And these can be inspired by the readings, but you also have done teamwork in your life, so you can think about that. And then take 2 minutes to try to sketch with one of your mates on the side how the different approaches to social cognition that we discussed could help us identify predictors of good or bad behavior, of good or bad teamwork, right? Conditions, setups of the groups, in which we expect the group to perform better compared to other conditions. And this is very vague, but it's just a warm-up exercise. We'll do the whole of today and the whole of Friday exactly on these topics. So take 1 minute alone, and then I'll give you the go for the discussion in pairs. Okay, you can go with discussions. Okay, so now that you've discussed this a bit, right? Anybody wants to start uh, giving us some tip on what would be good predictors or good ways of setting up teamwork? Yes. So I'm actually Actually, where would you put this, right? Social information processing, information integration, or interpersonally distributed cognition? No worries. So I put here that if we integrate information, our own information with somebody else's information, it's quite important to know how reliable it is, right? Because reliable information to have a higher weight than a unreliable information. So clear confidence levels. Yes. Yeah. Diversity of ideas, and we could make it even broader. If you're saying exploration, right? We might have different styles in exploring, right? Different ways of processing the information, um, perspectives, etc. Good. More? Yes. Yes. So we might call this, right? We need common ground, but also diversity. Can you elaborate a bit more on why do we need common ground? Yes. So, for instance, this is often called a common situation model. So we know where we are and what we want to do, right? Another level of common ground that might be easy to specify is, for instance, if I say I'm very sure that we should go that way, we might need to have a shared representation of what very sure means, right? Good. Other points? Yes. Okay, so you're saying there might need to be different roles. Can you elaborate a bit more on why would we want different roles like leader and follower dynamics? Mm-hmm. Yes, this is so in a sense you're saying we need some sort of institutions of routines to figure out when to decide and how to decide. But you're also saying if we all have the same role, leader or follower, we're not going to get anywhere, right? And maybe leader and follower works in some context, in other contexts, different roles, but it's the principle that counts. Good. Yes. That's this is a good point. So for the people on Zoom, the point is shouldn't just be the most confident person to decide. And that is certainly better than just doing the average across all members of the group. It also makes for what it's called a weak teamwork model. That is, the team will work only as well as the best of the members of the group. While a strong teamwork model would say that actually the group can do better than the best, right? Uh, so I think it's a good point. Like the most confident should go, but how do we define the most competent, and confident? Might require negotiation, changes over time, and so on and so forth. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Uh, yes, keep on. I'm just trying to think, yeah. Yes. So I think this is a crucial point that these different aspects sort of have reciprocal feedback because if we want to be able to effectively integrate information, we need to have clear confidence levels, which are shared across people, but that requires a lot of communication, right? And that requires the ability to adjust things over time. Yes. Cool. Other points? So last time we also said that in the social information processing, we had paradigms like the theory of mind or the mimicry ideas. Right? So in principle, and I'll show you some slides, we could imagine that, well, actually teamwork works best if at least one person or all the members of the group have good theory of mind abilities, right? And teamwork can only work if the participants, the members of the group, are eager and able to sort of mirror each other, reuse each other's confidence expressions, adjust to each other bodily style and interaction, and so on and so forth. Right. So we can actually, even just with a very brief brainstorming, we can take some of what we have learned about social cognition and start making predictions about how to better structure teamwork. Right? Does this make sense? Right. So what we're going to do now is going to follow through in a bit more articulated way and try to think how we can do this and whether the evidence out there support this kind of hypothesis. Right. The first one is we could say, does theory of mind, or otherwise called perspective taking ability, affect teamwork quality? Right. We take a very standard perspective on what social cognition is and what it takes to interact with others. We take some standardized tools in the literature. We measure these abilities or propensities in the members of the groups. Different groups will have different levels of theory of mind in their individuals. And then we can say that those that have higher are better at teamwork, right? There's a million papers out there. We can do the same with mimicry, right? We can take some paradigm or some video of the interactions of the teams, measure some form of behavior, how much is actually taken up by the other members of the group as soon as one uses it, and see whether these kind of mimicry, right, predicts which groups are performing better. Again, a million papers out there, right? We can do that for a million other ways of measuring social cognition, but I have slides on these too. We then, as we start thinking about how to run this study, right, we might need to figure out some technical stuff, and I'm mentioning them because if there's possible exam papers in this kind of approaches. For instance, how do we operationalize the relation between individual skills and teamwork, right? Should we take the higher score in the group? Like if there is at least one person with high theory of mind in the group, the teamwork should work. Or should we take an average score? Would be the same for metacognition if we want to talk about confidence, right? Do we take the one who has the best ability to assess confidence, or should everybody be there? Should we take a ratio, right? What's the ratio between the highest and the lowest? And these are non-trivial decisions that change drastically the results, right? So that's something to always keep in mind when you go and look at these papers on the topic, that they make one decision. I don't think I've seen a single paper that reports more than one decision. And uh, it's an open question whether they generalize across decisions. But then we go and pick a tool that we can use to measure, let's say, theory of mind. And again, we shouldn't do that. I've done that a million times. I've taken whatever questionnaire or task that other people in the field have used without thinking critically. But we should be always very aware and critical about what the tools that we pick are measuring. There is a really fun paper that takes all the tools that they could find that purportedly measure theory of mind in the description of the tool and in the papers that use them. And here there's a few examples: emotion recognition from faces, emotion recognition from voices, false belief task. You know, the false belief where, you have, I'm here, I take out the chalks and I hide them here. And then inside the chalk thing, I put a piece of candy. And then I get out of the room and, oh, sorry. And then you go out. No, maybe I didn't explain it properly. Sorry. So let's say that you come in and you hide a candy here, right? And then you go out. And then I come in and I take the candy out and I put back a piece of chalk, right? And then I go out again and you come in. And then we ask to the participant, where will the cogsci student search for the candy, right? And if the participant has a good theory of mind, they will know that you went out, so you cannot know that I replaced the candy, and therefore will say in the chalk box. But if you don't have, the participant doesn't have a good theory of mind, they will say, oh, down here in the projector, right? Because they don't have a good representation of the mental state of the person that's out of the room. Other tasks are intention detection from kinematics. You see some movements, sometimes just dots of lights moving, and then you need to sort of figure out what these figure that's represented as dots of lights is doing, right? And there's a really nice conceptual analysis of all these tasks that shows that actually most of these tasks quite definitely measure something else primarily, and theory of mind only with a question mark. For instance, emotion recognition from faces, well, it has a strong focus on the ability to parse in an effective way and faces, facial stimuli, and discriminate different emotions. It has not much to do with the ability of representing mental states, right? Emotion recognition from voice is the same. It's the ability to hear prosodic information and discriminate different profiles of prosodic information. That doesn't mean that in real life we don't use that as well as part of our social cognition, but it's not specific to theory of mind, right? Then we have intention detection from kinematics, which again is the ability to parse and discriminate different profiles of movements and so on and so forth. So again, we need to be very careful. With that caution, we can go and see whether the literature is telling us that having high theory of mind predicts good teamwork, right? The results are very mixed, right? We can see that, for instance, theory of mind supposedly helps in a series of tasks like collaborating in a prisoner dilemma, do a search and rescue, coordinate in a search and rescue simulation, and sharing mental models of the situation, right? Which is a important part for common ground, right? For being able to effectively share information. So it's not useless. But for instance, if we go into clinical populations where really the notion of theory of mind has emerged, right? Autism, schizophrenia, right? If we measure the theory of mind and we see whether that predicts the ability to function in society, there's basically no predictions. Actually, you can use basic cognitive abilities and they predict social functioning better than theory of mind. Also, in clinical populations and in non-clinical population, if you do interventions to improve theory of mind, you don't improve the ability to do teamwork after compared to before, which is kind of also damning in terms of if we want to have a strong causal interpretation of these relations, right? And so I asked stable diffusion model to generate a cognitive scientist that looks like me shrugging. And you can see that the results are very mixed, like in the literature. Right? So what about mimicry? Does mimicry work? Well, and there's really a lot of paper that assert that yes, mimicry works. Both the tendency to reuse the other person's gesture and posture and nodding, but even more, there's a lot of papers that say that if you reuse the other person's words and vice versa, these peer interlocutors groups will tend to perform much better. For instance, in the Pickering and Garrod literature, the idea is that understanding what you say is hard, right? So when I listen to what you say, I sort of prime the cognitive functions, neural processes, however you wanna, whichever level you wanna go, that I use to also produce the same words, which of course are connected to syntax and meaning. And that means that whenever I speak, I tend to reuse, I have those processes already pre-activated. They're easier to just go through. And our words and behaviors and eventually mental representations, situation models, become more and more in sync so that it requires less work to coordinate, right? However, I tried it out in many, many papers and it never works. Actually, we find very strong results of the opposite. That is, the more mimicry, the worse the performance of the team. And what's going on, I have a whole few slides towards the end of the lecture to explain this. But just to start saying that we can draw conclusions or draw hypotheses from these ideas of social cognition, and then we go and look at how they work. They're not the full story, like very clearly. And again, the picture is very mixed. So what if we take the second perspective, right? Maybe this whole idea of just a generic theory of mind and a generic mimicry is not good enough. We might want to focus much more on how we actually use information from other to integrate with our own information and make more informed decisions or actions or whatever, right? And here there's a bit of a story, which I find much more interesting than just talking about a bunch of different papers. This is a study that was a very paradigm-breaking study that was developed here in Aarhus. I was going to say a few years ago, but it's 15 years ago, by Bahadur Barami as part of the Interacting Mind project, which was born as an attempt at taking traditional experiments in cognitive science and psychology, and instead of putting one person solving the task, putting two people solving the task. And initially, it was just, and then let's see what happens. And then theories developed, right? But what Bahadur was doing is he had two people repeatedly discussing and solving a problem together. You can see there the problem. It's probably hard to see, but you are in a dark room facing two identical computers, but not each other, for 80 milliseconds, which is really hard to see. I think it was 6 Gabor patches, 6 patterns of visual noise appeared, and one of them maybe was a bit darker. Then you had a second of fixation cross, and then you had again 80 milliseconds of 6 Gabor patches, and maybe one of them was a bit darker. In each trial, it was only in the first or in the second interval that you got something that was a bit darker, right? And the task was tell the computer which of the two stimuli contained the oddball, the darker patch. You might say one, I might say one, and then the computer would say, well, next one. But if you say one and I say two, then the computer says, well, your decisions disagree, please discuss. And this happened again and again and again. And then Bahadur was interested in, do people get better than the best of the two individuals? Right? So he was interested in collective performance as the joint performance divided the best of the two individuals. Right? You recognize the paradigm from the equality bias paper because we're going to get there, but this was the origin story. Right? And so what he found was that some pairs had very diverse performance from each other individually. In some pairs, the individuals were very similar. And this similarity in performance was really what drove the collective performance. The more similar in performance the two individuals were, the better they became together compared to the best of the two individuals. Right? That's a very strong test of the benefit of teamwork. So Bahadur started wondering what is going on, right? Why is the similarity really driving this benefit? And that's where the equality bias paper comes in, right? So he went across 3 different cultures: Denmark, Iran, and China. If you read the paper, it's because they're very diverse across different axes. True story is Bahadur was a postdoc in Denmark. He was from Iran, and there were a lot of funds to promote China-Denmark collaborations at that point. But that's how a lot of science happens, by happenstance. And he was interested in trying really to disentangle the reason for which two similar people would collaborate well and two dissimilar people would not. So he slightly changed the paradigm in that people don't just say it's the first or the second stimulus, but they actually say how confident they are in that decision, right? And they do so privately, right? So we know what's going on. It's not necessarily open to the other unless they explicitly talk about the confidence. And they can also then take the idea that your classmate, and I can't remember your name, yours? Christian, yes. That Christian was saying that maybe we should pick in every trial the one that's the most confident and just go for that, right? And then we can see whether that model would perform better than our peers. And we can see how close the different peers get to this or where they differ in their decisions. So, well, this is just repeating that. I should follow you depending on how your performance compares to mine, right? The better you are compared to me, the more I should follow you. The worse you are compared to me, the less I should follow you. This would lead, though, to no improvement on the best participant. So what we can do is we can adjust on a trial-by-trial basis on the confidence, because even the best participant might be blinking when that stimulus is coming, right? Might be distracted, might be thinking about something else. And so the express confidence should allow for this, right? If we talk about, well, this time I didn't see shit, right? Then we might go for your decision. If I say, well, I'm almost sure that it was on the right, but then you say, well, I actually saw it pretty clearly, then we might go with yours, right? Independently on whether generally I'm better than you, because we are recalibrating on a running base. Yeah, I can actually skip that. That's not very important. And so we can actually devise a equation that solves that. We're not going to go too much into detail there. But what we find is that, actually, I should go here, is that if we take the less competent participant, which is the one dark, competent in that specific task, right? Maybe they didn't have their glasses that day. And the more competent participants, that's the white one, and we see how much their decisions are weighted in the joint decision, we see that the less sensitive participants' decisions are generally overweighted. They're given more importance compared to what their privately rated confidence would lead us to. And the ones who are better tend to be underweighted, right? Their decisions in the joint decision tend to be considered less than what they should be considered, even taking into account the confidence. And I should have picked, the picture better. I didn't have time to reanalyze the data to show it properly, but that's the story, right? If you're good, we're going to use your decisions a bit less than we should. And if I'm bad, you're still going to give me a chance and consider my decisions a bit better than they should be considered, right? And they call this the equality bias, right? That people across these three very different cultures tend to behave as if their interlocutors are just as good or as bad as themselves, or at least they tend towards that equality. And they tend to behave as themselves are just as good or bad as their interlocutors, right? They tend to, as a tendency, they tend to equalize the consideration of the decisions, no matter the differentials in performance and confidence. This is a solid result even in the follow-up experiments, where they actually receive a running score of their own and the pattern performance. So it's not that they're bad at seeing who's good and who's bad. They get told, and they still equally weight the decisions. Also, when Bahadur sneakily decides to really increase the difference in performance, they have a few practice trials, they see who's worse at the task, and they actually make a much smaller contrast between the darker patch and the other patches only for that participant, right? So even if the disparity in performance is really in your face, people still equally weight things. 4, he talked to economists, and economist says, of course, people are doing, this nice social game. That's because there's no true value at stake. You got to pay them according to performance. But even if you pay them according to performance, that doesn't help. People still put equality in their ways of doing decisions, right? Oh, shit. But so equal levels of performance and equal accuracy in metacognition confidence are good for teamwork, right? Because we're bad at making a difference in people who are better at the performance and people who are good at the performance. Alternatively, according to the paper, one could also be more objective in weighting contributions, and that would mean that even a pair that has unequal performance could still benefit from the collaboration. But people tend not to do that, right? And then I actually read this paper, and there are many things that I really love with the paper, and I teach it, so I think it's fair. But I also have both statistical, but that's a different story. That's for a different course, and conceptual issues with the conclusion. Because what I think that they're missing is that they are considering the task as a closed universe where people can adopt strategies that are optimal for that specific task without considering how people behave in the real world. What are the incentives and good strategies in the real world, right? So imagine that, I have to do this task with Christian, right? And I'm terrible at this, but Christian also knows I'm going to grade his exam. So he might want to give me some credit in my decision. If you're doing it with one of your peers in the class, right, those are your buddies. You're going to do study groups together. You're going to go to parties together. Actually, not having an optimal decision is a very small price to pay to have a more pleasant interaction. Also, you don't want to come out as an asshole, right? Even if it's a stranger. In real life, we don't do one thing, right? We do many different activities with often the same partners. So keeping sort of an open mind to what the other contributes, even if they're not really good at these tasks, might not be a good idea because we do lots of different tasks, right? And on average, it will even out. Also, even if one is better, in real world, tasks tend to change. The landscape that we explore has changed. The reward structures tend to change. So actually being open for different ways of solving the problem is not necessarily a bad thing. And then there's keeping faith and share motivation, right? So you want to not be an asshole. You want to keep everybody engaged. If I start really putting down Christian every time that he makes a contribution, he won't keep trying hard at the task. Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that's also something that we will discuss after the break. But yes, so this was the similarity, right? So there are good reasons to think that having certain kinds of similarity might help, given our cognitive biases, given our interactional biases. We want to be a bit critical, as always. And then after the break, we'll discuss the diversity angle. Yes. Okay, so I think this book, The Difference by Scott Page. Scott Page is formerly a physicist who now does political science at the University of Michigan, last time I checked. Um, he did a lot of work, for instance, on the Netflix Prize, and I'll mention that a bit, and on different mathematical and computational modeling of problem solving in collective settings. Published some really cool books on that, and then decided to go full pop and published a book called The Difference: How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups, Firms, Schools, and Society, which is a way of sort of legitimizing the idea that our societies are and will increasingly be diverse. That's not a bad thing. Um, oops. So premising that I really like Scott Page's work, but I think we don't actually need to justify diversity per se. It's a value in and on its own. But let's explore that idea, right? Diversity is touted as an engine for better problem solving and performance. We had a few points here, right? We can have different ideas that can get us unstuck from a blind alley or from a local minimum. We can have different styles to get to explore new products, new algorithms, new ways of making movies, what have you, right? And perspectives. And these diversity is often operationalized in terms of cognitive or epistemic diversity, right? Diversity of ideas, styles, and perspectives, but is often also grounded in other kinds of, for instance, demographic or life experience diversities, right? So for instance, you do research on schizophrenia, you might want to talk to the relatives, patients, clinicians, because they have very different ideas as to what they would need to make things better, right? Or another fun example is there's probably a few hundreds by now papers in which they say, can we find autism or schizophrenia or depression just by looking at vocal patterns? Can we use the most fancy latest algorithm to just take a snippet of 10 seconds of voice and give you a diagnosis, right? We can even put it on App Store. And they're always touted as, there's a big crisis in the mental health world. If you want to get a diagnosis in Denmark of ADHD, right, in the public, you're probably going to get, I don't know, waiting time of 1 year, 1.5 years. If you want to go private, it's still 6 months. And therefore, if we can do it like just analyzing voice, we're going to make the word better. Right? And then you go and talk to the clinicians, for instance, and they're going to tell you, well, it's not the diagnosis that's the problem, right? Is that what we need to do is to create interventions, right? We need to do assessments. We need to figure out solutions, and that takes a lot of time. And the diagnosis is actually a way of getting to know the patient, which helps us designing these things. So it's not that part that's the waste or that's the inefficiency. But none of these paper does that, right? So if you get these different perspectives, you might actually optimize things. So one of the things that we've played with is there's, well, not as much in autism or ADHD, but for instance, in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, you need to do often cognitive assessments. So look at working memory, look at executive function, which are important variables to have for several reasons. We're not going to go into that. But the tasks to assess these are terribly, terribly boring and taxing for the patient. My partner works at a psychiatric department at the hospital, and when she has to test a patient, often the patient has to come in several times, right? Because they just get tired, right? These people with psychiatric conditions tend to also have impaired function, and that means they get tired and stressed and frustrated, and they're not very good at these tasks, and you put them and have them do this for 3 hours, right? So what if instead of doing the diagnosis, these algorithms can simply take a snippet and try to replicate the findings of the more labor-demanding cognitive testing, right? Which the clinician doesn't really get much from except from a number, right? So this idea that epistemic difference or cognitive difference is useful is often grounded not just in studies of teamwork, but actually in computational approaches. So I mentioned the last time we met that in machine learning, we use a lot of these diversity approaches, random forests, XGBoost, and so on and so forth. Mixture of experts are also becoming quite popular. And there's a beautiful analysis of the Netflix prize by Scott Page that really makes the point. Do you know the Netflix prize? Is it something that only old farts like me know? Okay, Netflix, when it started, it was actually not that many years ago. I think it was in 2008 and 2009, after they moved from sending VHS by mail, as they started, into actually streaming. They created a big data set of anonymized users making ratings of the movies. They segmented some users away and some movies from the same users away. And then they said, we use an algorithm to predict which movies user would like and which they wouldn't like. And if by using these data set, you create algorithms that predict the test set that we kept aside at least 10% better than our algorithm, you're going to win $1 million. And there's lots of details, but the story is you have a bunch of teams. All of them start working on that, and there's a few teams who are clearly better than the others, right? They're getting very close to the 10% increase, but they're really having a hard time getting there. So what they do is they decide to combine their algorithms. So one of them had a really good algorithm that would combine different sources of information. Another was really good at segmenting user profiles so that you could aggregate information across users in a more uh, effective way. And I can remember the third one. And their combined algorithms actually gets just above the threshold of the 10%, right? But what happens is that Netflix had imagined that this kind of situation would spur a lot of competition. So they said, well, your algorithm doesn't just need to perform 10% better than our algorithm. It has to keep performing best for like a month. And so all the other algorithms that were far, far beyond, like these three were like 2 or 3 points percentage above the next, they all got together. They combined their algorithms, and the combined algorithm actually performed equally well as the first three. Right? And they had to split the price. And so what Scott Page draws from that is that actually we can demonstrate mathematically, we can do simulation, but there are also real life examples in which not only by combining the very best, you get a better result, but if you combine enough of the very worst, you actually get just as good results, which is overdriving it, but I think it makes it easy to remember. Okay, so I think I've hit on that already, but these are some of the contexts in which these diversity, epistemic diversity, is shown to work. The first one is the wisdom of the crowd effects. It's a very historical example in which you have a big ox that you need to guess how much they weigh, or you have this big jar of beans at a local fair and you need to guess how many beans there are inside the jar. And then you have every person makes an independent guess. And very often the average across all the guesses is very close to the true value. Why is that? Because you have each person estimates having some error, right? And by aggregating all the estimates, you sort of average them out. And of course, you might have some farmers who would have more accurate guesses, but on average, nobody really knows how to count beans in a big jar, right? Everybody is more or less noisy in their measurement. So we can reduce overall biases and errors just by averaging across a large amount of independent raters, right? But of course, if you have one of you jumping up and says, it's 1,000, it's 1,000, it's 1,000, that's not going to be an independent rating again, and we have different effects, right? Another domain in which diversity has been shown to be quite good is when you have a problem where you have no obvious solutions, right? So for instance, where you need really a lot of information to find a solution that might work. So as a fictive example, imagine like the problem of masking during COVID, right? Is it good? Should we do it? How do we help people masking in the right conditions, right? And of course, you might need to have an epidemiologist who knows how the contagion works. But you also need to have social scientists who know how social contagion works. But you also need to have interface designer who can sort of make the masking better for a lot of contexts where it comes in the way, or change the waste bins in the city so that there's not masks flying everywhere because they don't fit inside, and stuff like that. Um, If we use the metaphor of the landscape, right? Right. If there's different domains of expertise, right? You might want to bring them all together so you actually can see more of the landscape. Also, there's something about changing landscapes. That's something that is widely studied in evolution, like biological evolution or even cultural evolution. You have that if the world changes very quickly, you don't want to be optimized to solve problem as things are here and now, right? You want to keep lots of inefficient solutions around because as the world changes, some of them might turn out to be better, right? So flying is, of course, a very efficient way of moving across Europe, but in a climate change condition, there are many situations in which train is slower but more efficient, right? If we had optimized everything for flights and completely disregarded trains, we would be in a worse situation than we already are. So another one is that we can really get advantages from this if we have ability and motivation to effectively share and integrate information. That leads me to the issue of diversity. That, oops, sorry, I'm going to move Gustav. It doesn't want to move. Okay, so diversity, for instance, demographic and cognitive dissimilarity brings to increased conflict, worse communication, lower satisfaction, less optimal research and acceptance of information. That's a meta-analysis by Stahl et al. Called Unraveling the Effects of Cultural Diversity in Teams. This means, right, that if you have a group that has, oh my God, half women, half men, right? Or however, non-binary. Um, if you have, a group in which there's ethnic diversity, right? There tends to be miscommunication, right? People come from different places. People come from with different sensitivities and sensibilities. There are issues coming up, right? It will take work to communicate effectively, to accept each other's way of communicating information. Stupid example, when I came to Denmark 20 years ago and something, my style of interaction would be to touch people when I was talking to them. That didn't lead to high satisfaction in most of the people that I was talking to. And also, when people would get away from me, I would get a bit annoyed. When I was living in Gellerup, I would often be on the bus with these teenagers coming very close with what very politically correctly is called a ghetto blaster, right? And music. And people would, is like instinctively get away from them. But me being darker than the average Dane and clearly out of my place there, I ended up talking to a few of them and they just wanted to talk to people, right? But you got these bad feedback loops where a way of maybe provocatorily trying to engage sort of spiraled away in a conflict. Which is actually a paradox in a lot of the theories of how to reduce prejudice, where big theory is that you just need to increase contact. But actually, contact is not enough to reduce prejudice because if you're already positively predisposed, it tends to increase the positive predisposition. But if you're negatively predisposed, it tends to polarize the other way, probably because of these feedback loops. So such costs might, from a purely performance-based perspective, outweigh the benefits of diversity. So this is something that's called the diversity hump. So the inclusion of demographic minorities or those with very different ideas might initially be met with negative interactional outcomes. There is a review paper there that tries to see whether these things change over time. It's very interesting, but it's very complex. Uh, Feel free to follow. But the basic idea is that if there are initiatives in place and structures to facilitate interactions, positive interactions in a diverse context, what happens is that diversity not only increases the range of information that are brought to the problem solving, but actually increases the ability and willingness of people to even consider diverse perspectives, right? Which is not a trivial endeavor. So, just because we have a lot of content, wrapping up, we have that from the literature that we covered, which is very partial. It's only a small piece of the literature. I tried to give you a good taste, though. We have that there's ideas about similarity in performance, in situation models, in perspectives and values, might make it easier to communicate, might make it easier to engage, right? And diversity might bring diverse information, skill, perspectives, but it might make it harder to communicate. It might make a harder challenge to focus on performance when you have so much phase management at stake, right? Um, So for instance, there's a lot of findings. I can share a few papers if you want on males or men tending to overrate their own confidence and underrate female or women's confidence, right? And women tending to actually also do the same. So underrate their own confidence and overrate the man's confidence. And when you have in a lot of these meetings somebody coming with a bit of an aggressive and frustrated stance by saying you should actually listen to the woman more, right? You might get a complete closing of the wall, right? You are treading on my feet. You're saying I'm a sexist. Denmark doesn't have any sexism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Um, so it creates challenges, right? And we need to figure out how to put them together. And that's where I want to bring in the third angle, which is social cognition as an interpersonally distributed process. That we can really understand better how we create common ground and how we deal with diversity only if we start looking at what happens in the interaction, at the way that information is created and processed throughout the way we engage with each other. And so this is where I come in that Bahadur story. So I was a PhD student working on something completely different. I was getting frustrated with writing a dissertation that was supposed to be 500 pages because Italy. And so I decided that I would participate to experiments, to learn stuff and not to have to get frustrated about writing. And I ended up sitting as one of the participants in these experiments. And I got really intrigued by what was happening through these interactions. So here is a case where there's two participants who are discussing. They're well in the experiment, this interaction number 43. And A goes, we take yours because I saw nothing. And B goes, I didn't see anything either. I saw. And A goes, I saw, I took a bet. And then together they say, way to go. And then B goes, mine was also just a bet there. Interaction 44, they laugh. B says, I don't know. A says, I don't know either. A says, I saw something both in the left corner and in the center on the right in both of them. And B says, okay, I think it was over in the left side, but I'll pass. And then they click the button and A says, no. And B says, we ruined the scores. Now we must. And A goes, yes, now we must pull ourselves together, right? And so given the discussion we've had so far, what do you see there? Yes. Yeah, they're doing a lot of good face management, right? So I'm not better than you actually. And oh yes, we need to do things together. So they're really focusing a lot on face management. Yes. Yeah. But one funny thing that happens is that they do that with very specific conversational moves, right? So yes. But also, I think that just that I didn't see anything. If we think about our discussion on confidence, they state that they're not better than the other by expressing low confidence. By expressing low confidence, they create expressions to convey their confidence levels, which are taken up by the other, right? The first one says, I saw nothing. The second one keeps using the same template. I didn't see anything. Then A introduced another way of talking about confidence. I took a bet. Then in the next, uh, they start by using don't know, but then they go back to see. I saw something, right? They start carving some shared ways of expressing confidence in the same format. And at this stage, 43 interactions in, they're still keeping a lot of different ways open, but they tend to get there. Right? This is actually my claim to fame. So I went to Christian's Tulane's office uh, after saying I was in this experiment and I think there's something we should do. And then he was just back from his parental leave, so he was sure I'm not doing anything these days. So let's try. And then we did this study that became so famous we ended up in a comic book. Uh, what did the test subjects talk about? Well, it's all about confidence, right? How confident is each person in what they have seen, right? How do they compare notes on their own confidence? That's really what they're doing together with the face management game, right? So what we did is we went and started coding all the confidence expressions in families where I didn't see anything, I saw something, were all the same kind of template for talking about confidence. And we said that they were aligning to each other if in one interaction, an interlocutor used a kind of expression, and in the next interaction, the other picked it up. It doesn't need to be the same level of confidence, just the same template for talking about confidence. Then we look at whether that propensity was related to performance. And again, performance was how much better the diet becomes compared to the best of the two individuals. See that on average, if I use an expression, you will reuse it 60% of the time in the next interaction, which is not terribly high, but it seemed very cool at that point. And if you look at this, again, I'm very ashamed. There's 16 pairs. I would never, never attempt to publish something like that these days, but it worked at that time. And we can see that there is a more or less clear pattern where participants who tend to align less tend to gain a worse benefit from the interaction. Participants who tend to align more, they tend to perform better than the best of the individuals, right? Then I'm happy. I write the paper, we submit it to a journal, and then reviewer two comes, right? And says, is it really alignment on a short-term basis? As I was saying, Valeria tells me I see, I process that, and I have some pre-activated to see representations in my mind. So when I talk again, I reuse it, but this is between interactions, right? And it's not exactly the same words. Are you sure we're really measuring alignment? And anyways, you know nothing, reviewer two, right? All the literature, right, is doing exactly this. There's maze games where people just look at how people talk about these tiles or directions. That's what the literature is doing. Even your paper reviewer too, because I know who you are. But then Christian talked me down and said, well, actually, we should do the analysis they want, right? Do people reuse the word no matter what it is about? I was sure, fine. I go to my cave and I start coding. we see that actually people tend to reuse the words of their interlocutor half of the time, which is much higher. And there is a much stronger negative correlation. The more they tend to reuse the other person's words, the less benefit they gain from interaction, right? And they fall much more on the line than the previous one. It's a correlation of point. I can't remember now, actually, but it doesn't matter. It's much stronger, right? So we rewrite the paper and we say that language can be used to create shared formats and scales for confidence. This is where we get the useful similarity and common ground, right? But we need to contribute complementary and not similar information, right? So the format allows us to communicate more easily, but we should not overlap in what we say. And how do we then contribute complementary information, given all that phase management that's going on? So we had another study where we were trying to investigate this. That's called Agreeing is Not Enough. That was done in collaboration with Lego, where they gave us a bunch of boxes of Legos. And then we asked people to, in groups of 6, to build Lego models of abstract concepts like collaboration, peace, and a few others that now I can't remember, knowledge, and so on and so forth. And then we had a very skilled PhD student, Joanne Steyer Philipsen, who went and transcribed these interactions and started looking at how different styles in engaging the others would result in different kinds of models. So for instance, there would be models like this, where you have a model of collaboration, where subject 3 says, I'm thinking something with some bridges on the left, and subject 1 says, I was thinking of someone rope pulling in the middle, and S5 says, what about collaboration via external satellites, right? And they just made a model. So it's a very concrete but incoherent model. And the style of conversation that tended to lead to these kind of models was the yes, and here is my little piece, right? So people basically just added to each other. Another kind of model that we got was a coherent exemplification of the concept, where you have one subject, one participant that tends to tell the story about what's going on. I'm thinking something kind of like an assembly line. All the time, one is dependent on the one next to you. And then there's the other participant that says, then that's the boss. But then immediately the first participant gets seen and takes the role back and says, yeah, and that it becomes reach that required that people collaborate well, right? So it takes away from what the other was saying and sort of re-puts it in his own frame. And this is what is in conversation analysis called other-initiated self-concluded repair, right? You try to correct or integrate what I'm doing, and I sort of take what you're trying to correct, but go back into my original direction, right? I acknowledge you tried to repair, says yes, yes, but then I don't take that into account, really. Or we had models that, oh, sorry, didn't account for that. But there's a model that is coherent, but where actually several people have contributed in building it. There is a shovel, well, that could be about working, and then another subject takes it up and says doing something together. And then a third subject goes, could we make it so that when you work together, then you achieve a higher goal? And there's, going up the pillar. And then the first subject, should we also make some opposition there? And the third subject goes, you can show that collaboration has to be like this good by showing the opposite. What happens when you don't collaborate? It could be something like if they go their individual ways, they won't get up the ladder, right? So you get that people are challenging or contributing information, and they're allowed to sort of do that. But then they get in turn challenged and integrated. So you get that there's very different styles in how you can manage diversity of information. So the home message is that, take home message is that we need to distribute and integrate cognitive labor in a task appropriate fashion, right? We've seen in the optimal interacting minds that there are certain information, the way we talk about confidence, which is very important we get similar. But then once we have that shared format, we need to use it to do different things. And we replicated that in other tasks like the map task, where people need to navigate a map, and the alien game, where people need to figure out they're traveling in outer space and meeting aliens and need to figure out which of these aliens are dangerous. And the process through which we distribute and integrate cognitive labor might depend on individual abilities. We've seen some studies that point through that, but the picture is very mixed. Might depend on similarity and diversity. But what I would argue is that perhaps even more determinant on performance is the process, right? Is how we actually engage, solicit, and integrate the information. You might have a group that is less diverse in ideas, but is better at integrating. They might explore the landscape of solution better than one that is more diverse, but doesn't have a good engagement strategy, right? And that's perhaps where like similar teams often seem to perform better, because there is not a focus on this work of getting things to function. One of the things that I'm very preoccupied with these days is that we see that we need to consider the task appropriate way, right? So when we do the optimally interacting minds, we need to talk about confidence. When we do the alien game that I was mentioning, we need to identify features in the aliens that might be predictive of danger. And carving the possible visual space or feature space with language is what we need to do. But I have no idea how to make a general theory that tells me on a context by context base, this is what you should do, more than words, like I want something formal. But that's a big challenge in the field. So benefits of teamwork can be reaped when the task is non-trivial, not easily solved by individuals, when the information provided by the interacting agents is different but complementary. Right? What do I mean by that? Different could simply be that one of you tells me, oh, I didn't see anything in that task. And I say, well, I watched The Bear last night. It was amazing. Right? It's very diverse, even if we measure the semantic content of the two. And The Bear is amazing. The TV series on Disney Channel. But it doesn't really help. It's not complementary given the task demands. And it needs to be somewhat reliable or with reliably communicated confidence. And it is necessary that information is actually shared and taken into account, that is communicated, understood, and challenged, but not disincentivized, distrusted, or ignored. And again, this is a lot of words, right? There's a lot of work to make it concrete and work in context and do better experiments, but I think that's the general picture that the field is pointing to. I have a little devil's advocate pointer, which I think is very interesting, and we'll discuss it more in detail on Friday, which is if, right, we have a diverse group, which is good, diverse perspective, diverse ideas, diverse feelings, right? We need to do work to overcome the diversity, the difficulty in communicating, trusting, sharing, eliciting, et cetera, and we get to integrate information. And by integrating information to a certain extent, we become more similar, right? We work on this specific problem. You get some crazy idea. I got some crazy ideas after I have both your and my crazy idea. But by becoming more similar, we reduce diversity. And is this an issue? Right? Does that mean that the next time that we collaborate, we're not as productive as we could be because we established with a lot of good work and well-intentioned work, routines and shared ways of thinking that reduce the diversity of our thinking, right? And again, I think that that's a very important issue. I found that there is a bit of research on this in the military literature in the States. I don't know if you know that the military in the States, the defense of the Department of Defense, DoD, is one of the biggest funders of research. If you work in the States, somehow you almost always have some sort of military funding, and you need to figure out ethically what you want to do with that. Uh, but they funded research, for instance, in how do you train a team? Let's say that we train a team to do reconnaissance missions, right, in the desert. And then we can have two conditions. In one, it's always the same 5 people who get really good coordination dynamics. They do 10 missions, right? And then they test it on a new mission in the desert, and they're going to be performing much better than the team where at every mission, one of the members was shifted out and somebody else was brought in. And it wasn't necessarily somebody who wasn't experienced. It could be somebody from another group that had been going on the same amount of missions. And at the end, they would perform slightly worse than the team where they were collaborating all the time, which would seem to support the idea of similarity as the key. Except then they send them to a mission in a different place with different challenges. Let's say they send them to Denmark. And what happens is that the team where you had the member rotation performs better than the other team, which if you want to put it in machine learning parlance, is also an issue of overfitting, right? But in the Scrabble experiment, we'll get actually to measure whether this is true. Well, not this whole story, but whether collaborating reduces diversity. Right? Questions on this? Well, exam paper, I have 4 minutes. That's perfect. There is an example of exam paper on these topics. There could be a million. But what the student did in this case was Josephine took a task that was been published already, in which you have a bunch of gears, and if you turn the first gear in one direction, the movement will propagate, and it will either open the gate between the little rabbit and the carrot, or the gate between a lion and a rabbit, right? And according to which animal you prefer, one outcome is a bad outcome and the other outcome is a good outcome, right? And it's being used a lot to study how children learn to abstract, right? Because you can follow with your finger, or you can say left, right, left, right, left, right, or you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if it's odds is one way, if it's even, it's the other way, right? But Josephine thought maybe we should put 2 people there, right? Solving it and see whether they're better at reaching the abstraction level than the individuals. And not only that, maybe we should take more different conditions where, sometimes you just perform as a dyad from the very start. So from the very first of these levels, you play together. Sometimes you start as individuals, do 5 levels, and then you get joined as a dyad. And then she was interested in analyzing if the percentage of dyads that would, or of participants that would reach the highest level of abstraction would change in these different conditions. Where the first one, you have the individual, very low diversity. In the second one, you have the dyads. They're more diverse. There's more power, whatever, but they tend to collaborate from the very start, reducing the diversity. And the third one, we allow diversity of experience to emerge in the task, and only then we put them together. And you can read more about that in the paper. Right? So this is a very common format for an exam paper. You take whatever uh, experiment in psychophysics, cognitive psychology, cognitive science, wherever, and you sort of see whether you can put two people or very specific kinds of diets playing it and see how they perform. What we're going to do next is on Friday, we're going to say, given what we learned today, how do we design a pseudo exam paper on that kind of data? And of course, I kind of given you the paradigm already, but we can discuss what motivates it, which kind of analysis would be fun to run. And I've done some both analysis that you're already able to do, but also some network analysis of how the different words get extracted. And I think that's going to be fun. And then we're going to see this, how it works on science. With that, I thank you, and I'll see you on Friday.